welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. Today is Friday, September 2018, and we're going to continue a series of kind of going back and revisiting some of the original blog post articles from the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website, which captured some of the concepts and ideas that I had to process myself as I was going through my own faith transition, where I learned that there was a wider world beyond the faith box that I was put in, being born as a Mormon in the LDS Church. So if you watched our episode yesterday, there was a call by a gentleman named Gimpy Geezer, and he talked about his own journey. And one of the things that he was lamenting was the idea that he was very susceptible to the messaging that the church gave him as a young man, and that he totally bought their narrative about the truth of the world. And it was that truth that was so important, that kept him in that faithful mindset for so many decades of his own life. And it reminded me that there was a post where I talked a little bit about this, particularly how your own sense of integrity, your own sense of self, and kind of the psychological levers that are inherent to everybody's psyche is turned against themselves in a way to keep them bound to the church. And so I thought it would be fun to go back and revisit a blog post called The Lies That Bind. And so we're going to take some time and go through that post and then take some calls. It was originally written in October of 2013. If I recall correctly, I went back and revised it. Now, the talk is going to talk a little bit about, it'll use the metaphor of a shaman. And I've gotten some feedback from people saying that I'm exploiting some sort of sacred entity of some various indigenous races. And so I just want you to keep in mind what I'm using the shaman as a stand-in for is somebody who claims some special supernatural power, authority, or perception. If you want to use a term different than shaman, then just place that in there. But that's how it was written, and I'm not going to change it at this point. So let's take a look and see if we can pull it up. I will post, why don't I go ahead and do this? I will post a link in the comments so that if you want to read along with the original post, you can do that. And let's go ahead and bring this up in a way. Okay, it's called The Lies That Bind. All right, I'm going to move my microphone here so I get a little bit better audio when I do this. All right. Now, you'll notice this little picture of a World of Warcraft shaman orc figurine with a Mormon missionary tie and figure. When I first started making these blog posts, I would find an image of something having to do with the theme, and then I would make them a missionary. So there's some fun fun little image gems that you can find if you go through the website and look for those things. But let's start. All right. When a true believing Mormon, or TBM, stumbles across something in black and white published by the early church that completely contradicts the pristine narrative that the church presents about its early history and leaders, they're left with a bit of a quandary. What is the truth? Technology versus the shaman. Now, we live in an age where our minds are accustomed to having the truth of the things of the world presented and backed by logic, evidence, and science. If someone claiming special knowledge and power, like a shaman, were to state that there were people who lived on the moon or the sun, we would look for them to provide evidence to back up such a claim, since we know that there are ways to establish the truth of such statements. Before the modern age of science and reason, however, people could make outrageous claims, and since technology had not developed means to test the truth of those statements, no one could prove them wrong. "There are men just like us who live on the sun," says one ancient shaman. And again, these are examples of claims by early Mormon church leaders. You can click on the links to see the sources for those. "Our sun gets light from a powerful distant star near the seat of God," says another. Since there is no way to test these statements, the ancient primitives are imposed upon to trust that the shamans have access to some special, extraordinary knowledge. Remember, no one can prove them wrong. There is always this lingering suspicion, however, on the part of the primitives. What if the shaman is just lying to get attention and power? The acceptance of these truths are only tied to the shaman, and just as soon as enough people are willing to denounce the shaman, he may be disposed of outright and the false statements may be similarly abandoned. As an aside, the progress of technology is probably one of the reasons modern-day shamans had confined their prophesying to the metaphysical realm. No more predictions of Quakers on the moon, as you will find from early Mormon prophets. The myth of truth. This is an acknowledged shortcoming of any self-respecting shaman's game of deception. At one point, however, some of the most intelligent shamans figured out the secret to overcoming this weakness. Now, while it is not too hard for someone to reject another person, it is much harder to get someone to reject their own senses and feelings and beliefs. The greatest shamans will make outrageous statements and then tell their followers not to believe based on the shaman's testimony, but to turn to their own feelings to confirm the truth of the matter. Of course, the shamans will not say it bluntly like that. They will compose a myth of truth and tell the primitives that God or the universe will confirm truth through those feelings. The fact that this myth is just as suspect of the question for which one would apply it towards is usually lost on the primitives. The tender lie. The tender lie compounding this trap is the fact that the most successful shamans will use fantastic claims that appeal to the hearts and minds of the primitives. Grandiose stories of potential exaltation, eternal life, abundant treasures, all fantastic and desirable things. The shaman will plant the seed hand in hand with this good news that he is uniquely gifted to shepherd the primitives towards these great promises. By offering devotion and deference to the shaman, the people can gain all that he tells them God or the universe has promised. Furthermore, these promises and requirements of devotion are couched in the tender, compassionate terms that ardently speak to the best nature in mankind. By committing to the shaman and his tender lie, the primitives demonstrate that their humility and willingness to submit to God. By committing to the shaman and his tender lie, the primitives demonstrate their humility and willingness to submit to God. But they don't realize that they are, in fact, just submitting to the shaman. To the primitive mind, it's so appealing. Good shamans will mix truth with lies so effectively that the primitives can't tell the difference. Exclusive knowledge about unknowable things. A God who is perfectly loving and benevolent. Absolute certainty about life in the present and in the hereafter. Comforting surety about the familial bonds that bring us joy now lasting forever. All of these things are very desirable to the primitive's mind. They want them to be true. They need them to be true. Ask God, and your bosom will burn and your heart will feel peace, and you will know that it is true. The primitive focuses all of his thoughts on these desires, and the pure possibility of them, combined with his own intense desire, resonates within his psyche, and he experiences a feeling. Perhaps it may be similar to the feeling he felt while listening to a rousing speech or sharing an emotional bond with a loved one, but it was there and it was real. Feelings are undeniably real, but this does not mean that they reliably indicate truth. The shaman seals his lie into the heart of the primitive, linking their fates together, a protective barrier that will shield both the shaman and the lie. For when or if the devotee ever doubts or questions the claims of the shaman, they must now doubt or question their own faculties. It is no longer a simple matter of rejecting the shaman. They must reject at least a part of themselves before they can reject the lie. Pride and the missionary trap. Furthermore, what if they have spent years testifying to others of the shaman's truth that they believed their feelings confirmed? When or if they discover that it is false, then they must face the humiliating fact that they mingled their own integrity with that of the lie and sold it to others, doing the deceptive work of the shaman for him. Suddenly, to accept the lie for what it is also means having to be humble and acknowledge that they were taken in by a swindle and perpetuated it upon others. To expose the lie means admitting that you were gullible enough to believe it in the first place and complicit in deceiving others. All of these negative pressures upon one's psyche create an even greater pressure not to acknowledge the lie for what it is. Denial of the truth becomes a defense mechanism, protecting the individual from the painful implications of their involvement with the lie, and ultimately defending the position of the shaman and his deception. No one likes to feel like a dupe or acknowledge that they unwittingly duped others. Mormon method. Now, bringing it closer to home. Mormons rely on a passage in the Book of Mormon to bring members to accept the validity and integrity of the book itself and, by association, the prophet who brought it into the world. Investigators to the faith are told to read a promise contained in the Book of Mormon. From Moroni chapter 10, verse 4, "And when ye shall receive these things, I would exhort you that ye would ask of God, the eternal Father, in the name of Christ, if these things are not true. And if ye shall ask with sincere heart and real intent, having faith in Christ, he will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of the Holy Ghost." Now, this ingenious verse establishes the method of asking and sets a sort of double bind upon the investigator. If the seeker experiences that resonation of feelings, he is to attribute it to the Holy Ghost and interpret it as a confirmation of truth. If no such experience occurs, however, then there must be a defect in the heart, intentions, or faith of the investigator. The missionaries will never allow the possibility that the book is actually not true, and so failings in the seeker are assumed. Perhaps there were sins that they still held from God, drinking coffee, lustful thoughts, anger towards a neighbor, or doubt. The investigator is urged to clean themselves up and try again. Their heart's insincerity or their lack of faith or real intent must be overcome. Finally, the seeker is compelled to accept any sort of feeling as confirmation. A bit of undigested gravy, heartburn, anything will do to confirm that their heart is sincere and that they may pass the test of faith. Other people's folly. The easy confidence with which I know another man's religion is folly teaches me to suspect that my own is also. Mark Twain. Now, Mark Twain's observation about other people's religion is actually an important step that one can take in seeing through the trap that the shaman has laid. Mormons are not the only faith that relies upon some manifestation of feelings to testify of the truth to its members. Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, and many other faiths use these reassuring feelings as means to determine truth, and they all point to conflicting conclusions. Yet people still adhere to what those feelings affirm to them. If the Holy Ghost or Spirit or whatever explanation is provided for the feelings was a reliable indicator of truth, it should direct people to the one true religion, and all these people in various faiths should converge on one truth. They do not. Each of these groups experience the feelings under the auspices of the myth of truth, binding them to their own group and the shamans over them. Lessons from Mormon offshoots. Examining the various offshoot sects of Mormonism presents an especially unique perspective. Each of these groups still relies on the Book of Mormon and the exact same promises to testify of truth. The truth of each sect. Why does the Holy Ghost not tell investigators of the Community of Christ or the fundamental Latter-day Saints that they are false and lead them to the one true mainstream LDS church? Now, members of those sects experience and use the exact same test and exact same feelings. What would a member of one of these groups do if confronted with incontrovertible proof of the false nature of their shaman? It turns out that circumstances have produced such an experiment. Let's watch this clip. Now, I've got to do some correction here because my little sidecar has crashed, and so I have to correct for that. Hold on here. Boop. Separate display. All right. Now, we're having technical times here. You got to forgive me. Okay. Boop. All right. So let's just try this. Let's turn it off. And we will disconnect. And then we will... I would say we'll just edit this out in post, but I've learned that there's really no post. Okay, so let's go back to my iPad and boop. Okay, I think we're in good condition. Yes, we are. All right, excellent. So here we go. Let's see. This is, again, an experiment wherein members of the FLDS church get to see what it's like to have incontrovertible proof that their prophet is a charlatan.
to Nephi, you can tell anybody who wants to read this message or see the video that they can see it.
Now I'm going to set this up a little bit. What we're watching is prison footage from a visitor to Warren Jeffs, who at this time is sitting in prison for, sexual abuse of minors, transporting minors for the purpose of sexual abuse, pedophilia. He's in prison, and he's dictating a revelation to a member of his sect that is visiting him. And this is how he would continue to convey messages to his followers. And so he's setting up and he's saying, anyone who wants to listen to this can read these words, and he's going to deliver what is a very important message. So let's keep going here.
Even apostates and Gentiles, that they may know that I have been a liar, and the truth is not in me. I am not the prophet. I never was the prophet.
You are the prophet.
Just a minute.
See, this is a key moment. He's specifically saying not only is he's not the prophet now, but he was never the prophet. And he's just a total liar. He just blatantly says this, but it's in this weird mode where he's saying it using the mode of revelation that he's used in the past in order to convey God's word to his followers. It's remarkable that he's doing this in the first place, but what is even more remarkable is that his scribe, the person who is tasked with the role of conveying God's word to the people, immediately contradicts him and says, no, you are the prophet. Even though the guy's confronting him with the reality of his fraud, the individual's, the forces within him that compel him to hold on to this belief reject it to his face. And so we're going to see how Jeff's responds to that. He initially says, hold a minute, and now we're going to see what the revelatory voice does.
The Lord's still dictating. This is not a test. This is a revelation from the Lord God of heaven. Through his former servant, who was never his servant, who is dictating these words at this time. That you may know this is not a test. I say farewell again to all who qualify for Zion. Farewell.
I love you. love you. We love you.
So there you can see the power that this spell has over the followers. He's telling them using this inherently contradictory message. You know, you can look at what he's saying from two perspectives. If you accept that he was a fraud and that at every point in the past he ever conveyed God's word, he was doing it on fraudulent terms, meaning he was using his own intentions, his own voice, and just elevating them to the level of God by falsely claiming it was God speaking, then you can understand that continues to be what he does. If you hold to the idea that he actually was God's prophet and he's still using the mode of conveying God's voice as he did in the past, then you're suddenly left with a inherent contradiction that is irreconcilable. And I'm told that later, you know, the people who continue to believe that he is a prophet say, well, that was God testing us, even though he said this is not a test. And I think there's some people say, well, it was, you know, Satan deceiving him for a brief period of time, but now he's back and now he's a real prophet. But at any rate, what this demonstrates is the power that this, this myth of truth, where it's not just the claims of the leader that keep them in power, it's also the integrity of each individual follower, their own mental integrity, their own sense of cohesive self, which is woven into the identity of the prophet. So if they reject the prophet, they have to reject a part of themselves. They have to admit that they've been deceived. They have to see that part of themselves as being shaped and formed by a lie. And it's so much harder to do than to simply reject a false prophet. So let's continue. Now, that is the prophet of the FLDS group, Warren Jeffs, giving a revelation from jail. In this revelation, he admits that he has lied about the whole thing. He states that he's not the prophet, nor has he ever been the prophet. He reinforces this and makes sure that his followers will believe him by stating, "This is not a test." Now, despite hearing this from the mouth of the man himself, using the same means of channeling God that he has previously pretended to, his scribe cannot accept or believe it, exclaiming, "You are the prophet, and we love you." The FLDS use the exact same test to know the truthfulness of what they believe. They pray about it and receive a prompting from the Spirit, testifying to them of the truthfulness of their interpretation of the gospel and the divinity of their prophet and leaders. The strength of their devotion is proven by the fact that the scribe still believes even after definitive proof to the contrary. How could the scribe accept the prophet's confession of betrayal when his own test of truth had confirmed the divinity of the prophet? He would have to admit that his feelings were not an absolute indicator of truth. Even the shaman himself may be powerless to break the spell that he's cast. Belief is clearly stronger than facts or evidence. Manipulated feelings. This is just one example among the multitude of religions that all use similar methods to bind their believers to their respective shamans. It is clear that the emotions and feelings that are being described as the Holy Ghost do not actually and reliably indicate truth. This does not leave the question of what it is that creates all these feelings that people are undoubtedly feeling. And I think I misstated that in that this does leave the question of what it is that creates all these feelings that people are undoubtedly feeling. Now, if somebody said that they could make you feel those feelings as a sort of programmed response, what would you think? Could you be manipulated in such a way? Well, let's watch the following YouTube playlist in order and take note of how you respond to the various depictions. All right. So let's take a look here. He was caught stealing. We missed that with the stuff covering up.
ไปอ้าวสั่งมาเร็วต่ออะไร
ผู้หญิงคนหนึ่งขอร้อง
Here's the second one.
ทำคลอดให้เธอก่อนกำหนดถามถึงเหตุผลเธอก็บอกแต่เพียงว่าเวลาของเราเหลือน้อยมากหลังทำคลอดเพียง2 ชั่วโมงเธออุ้มลูกแล้วก็หายไปชายคนหนึ่งกำลังจะตายด้วยโรคเนื้องอกในสมองที่สำคัญเขาควรจะยอมแพ้แล้วก็ตายไปตั้งนานแล้วในช่วงเวลาที่มนุษย์มีชีวิตอยู่มักมีคำถามเกิดขึ้นเสมอว่าเราเกิดมาทำไมเกิดมาเพื่ออะไรเด็กน้อยอยู่ในอ้อมกอดของพ่อทันเวลาบางทีคำถามนี้อาจไม่จำเป็นต้องตอบเรามีชีวิตอยู่เพื่อใครต่างหาก
ตัวเล็กดูแลแม่ดีๆนะครับรู้ไหมรักแม่ให้มากๆพ่อก็รักหนูมากเหมือนกันรู้ไหมครับพ่อรักหนูมากจริงๆดูแลแม่ดีๆนะลูก
ไทยประกันชีวิตบริษัทคนไทยเพื่อคนไทย
And the last one.
หนูอยากได้พ่อที่ดีกว่านี้พ่อที่ไม่เป็นใบ้พ่อที่เหมือนคนอื่นพ่อที่ได้ยินในสิ่งที่หนูอยากบอกพ่อที่พูดได้แล้วก็เข้าใจหนูได้
บางทีอาจจะไม่มีพ่อที่ดีที่สุดแต่มีพ่อที่รักคุณมากที่สุดดูแลคนที่ดูแลคุณ
ไทยประกันชีวิต
Okay, I didn't want to ugly cry on this podcast, okay? I knew it was coming. When I saw this playlist in 2013, it's like there's no way that you could not cry. I don't know. It's probably that these things, especially the ones that deal with being a dad, that's an important part of my own identity. Okay. All right, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is here to help. All right, Yu-Gi-Oh! You gotta cheer me up. Come on, Yugs. You can do it. No? Okay. All right, so, okay, I need to be able to continue reading. Okay, hold up. All right. Okay, Yugs. We can do this. All right. Okay, so if you are not at least partially moved to tears or experience a desire to purchase life insurance for your parents by the time you get to the last clip, then you need to be locked up as a dangerous psychopath. The producers of these videos knew exactly what response they wanted to elicit. Why can we be so predictably manipulated by emotion in such a way? Because even though you're feeling real emotions, the music, the timing, the themes, everything about those commercials was calculated and done specifically to evoke those emotions because our emotions are predictably manipulated. Now, it may not be for a single individual that they can be predictably manipulated, but on average, as a whole, there are very predictable ways that people in media and other things know that they can elicit emotional responses from people. And that predictability is a vulnerability, it's a liability, it's a way that we can be influenced in a very calculated way. And if you tie a myth of truth saying that if you feel feelings when you experience that feeling, then you have to know it's true, then that is a way that you are just ready to be manipulated if you accept that mythology of truth. All right, now I have to stop crying. All right, I've got tear stains on my shirt. Okay. So, Gimpy Geezer, when you were talking about how you're very empathetic, you may be somebody who will be particularly moved by things that have emotional suggestibility to it. So let's continue. Emotional resonance. Now, when you read or hear or experience something that confirms or magnifies what you already believe or want to believe, and which means a great deal to you, your mind and emotions resonate with it. And there's a link to a study that describes that on the word resonate. And you experience a palpable, visceral, and emotional response. In the case of these videos, we already have a strong belief in the sacred nature of familial love, and our own feelings of our own loved ones resonate within ourselves as we empathize with the events in the clips. These videos deal with family-based dramatic events, and the flavor of the emotional response is colored by that. There are other videos which could produce similar responses which resonate patriotism, peace, or love. Conversely, other videos could be used to resonate and amplify hate, anger, or despair in people who already cultivate such beliefs and feelings within their hearts. This phenomena is the foundational basis of advertising, marketing, and propaganda. The perpetrators of these arts attempt to elicit an emotional response within their audience and then link whatever product, concept, or program that they are promoting to that feeling. The viewer then develops an affinity that they believe comes from within themselves rather than from the manipulators behind such instruments. This explains why these feelings lead to people in various faiths to believe in those faiths. Each faith is promoting them with a message that resonates with why they want to believe or what the person already believes about God, life, and existence. These are all matters of great importance to the investigators, and so the possibility of emotional resonance is very high. This is what produces the feelings. They are not cosmic barometers of truth. The shaman already planted the myth that truth is manifested in such a manner. However, and so all these investigators are bound to their shamans and their deception by an even more powerful and insidious lie that few, if any, realize exists. Personal spiritual experiences. Many people have had personal spiritual experiences while under the spell of a deceptive shaman, and they use these experiences as evidence of the validity of their particular faith. This happens to Mormons, Catholics, Muslims, all faiths. Atheists will tell you that your mind has made unjustified connections about random events. Did you receive a generous gift of just the amount of money that was needed for some essential need? Well, that was just chance. You wanted to believe that God was watching over you, so you made a false connection in your mind, says the atheist. Now, it's true that these events could simply be explained as that. For those that still believe in God, stepping away from a deceptive and manipulative shaman comes several realizations. God would not consider your being a victim of a charlatan as a reason to deny you blessings or turn a deaf ear to your supplication. The times that you felt true peace when it was most needed, the comfort of a friend at just the right time, or the healing of a loved one's body or mind, all of those blessings may come from God no matter the circumstance or the lies under which you are bound. To a Mormon, this explains why there can be stories of miraculous healing from those of other faiths who do not have God's priesthood, from which those things are supposed to come. The shamans want you to believe that the only reason you are privileged with those experiences is because of your adherence to their creed. They use God's blessings as a trap to bind you closer to them. Breaking free from pride. The antidote to this binding deception is a tough pill to swallow. It is that way by design of the shaman. A person must humiliate themselves and acknowledge that they were taken in. They must admit that all the time and energy they spent promoting the lie and the shaman was done so in the service of a sham. It is at first humiliating, but then it becomes liberating. Truth seekers, willing to let go of the pride that binds them to deceivers, break free of the hold that the shamans have over them. Once free, they can start examining the world and their life honestly and without holding a part of themselves in reserve or captive to the will of another. This allows the seeker to pursue a relationship with God free from the unfounded and deceptive dictates of other men. The difficult way out. The pathway is not easy for the newly liberated primitive. The shaman specifically tailored their message to provide reassuring answers to all the fearful uncertainties that man has struggled with over the ages. Realizing that those comforting tales were simply the honey in the trap that they were bound in presents a frightening reality. Suddenly, you must reanalyze all of those issues and come to your own conclusions about them without some other person providing you with all the answers. In many instances, you will have to acknowledge that there can be no certain answers to some questions in this life. Liberation. Despite the difficulty, looking at the world through fresh eyes, free to follow the dictates of your own conscience, can be extremely rewarding. The unanswered questions provide opportunities to explore the possibilities of God and the universe. Breaking free from lifelong shackles is free to honestly approach the thoughts and experiences of men of all different faiths, philosophies, and persuasions, and find what speaks to your own heart and understanding of God and adopt it as your own. The shamans will line up to ridicule the liberated mind, mocking them as standing for nothing or being subject to the winds of the world. The hidden truth is that by accepting the lies of the shaman, one is shackling their mind and their soul to the whims of other men. They are denied the possibility of accepting truths that are outside of the shaman's web of deception and control. Breaking free from those chains allows men to use the mind that God has given them to find truth no matter where it comes from. God did not grant us inquisitive minds and the capacity for logic and reason only to have us abandon those gifts when it comes to the things that matter most. Okay, so this was written in 2013, and after that, I came across a music video by the band Panic at the Disco that had lyrics and imagery that I felt exemplified the theme of this particular talk. And so I added that video to the end of it, and we'll go for some of it now. I know this is going to probably get the video blocked from Facebook or something. But let's see what we got. Well, you know, I don't want to do the blocking of the video from Facebook, so I'll just encourage you to watch the video on your own. It's Panic at the Disco, This is Gospel, and you can see from the video, it starts out and there's this imagery of the young man sitting on a hospital gurney, and there are doctors that are poking him and tweaking him. The imagery here is that these, you know, doctors we generally trust with our vulnerabilities. We trust that they are bound to do what is best for us. And when we put our bodies in their hands, there is that understanding of trust that they are going to not work against us, not work against our interests. And the imagery here of using the doctors doing what they're doing is you quickly realize that they're putting him under some procedure that he does not consent to. And when he tries to break free, as they are trying to do their surgery and they put him under drugs, after they struggle to get him, he wants to get out. And so they're starting their procedure, and he wakes up and tries to break free. We can see a little bit of that here. All right, this imagery right here, and this is after the first verse, the chorus is, if you love me, let me go. Which is the idea that if, these relationships that we have with religious leaders, with parents, they say that they're doing the best for us, they want what's for the best for us, but when it comes then to having people betray their own hearts and minds in order to follow a dogma that cannot be justified by anything other than the claims of someone who purports to have a form of divine authority, which is inherently illegitimate, then you start to see the cage that you're bound in. And so I'll just let you watch the video. The part that really spoke to me, though, was there's a moment where there's kind of a baptism metaphor. He breaks free from it, and this is the part that is just phenomenal here. Let's see. Okay, so that's not the part. But so he breaks free out of the thing. He's breaking through walls, and I think it's the next part. I'm trying to break this up so that Facebook doesn't flag this as some sort of copyright violation. Hold on. Okay, this is the part. So if we back it up to what happens here, he, as part of them molding him, they put him in what is essentially a Mormon missionary outfit, and it's not lost on us that the lead singer here, if I recall correctly, was raised Mormon. But this moment right here, where they rip open his shirt and they pull from inside of him rope that they then use to bind him, is just a brilliant, beautiful metaphor for using our own psychological levers, our own emotions, our own sense of integrity to bind us in the cage of Mormonism. Because you can see it, they pull the rope out and then they wrap it all around him. And that's his prison. Even the chorus where it's talking about the fear of falling apart is alluding to the type of control that happens when religious authorities infuse fear of damnation or fear of burning or fear of losing yourself if you break from the fold. It's all woven together into this prison. And I just love the use of imagery here with the ropes coming out from inside of you and then being used to bind. So that's the reason that video is part of this. Okay, and my commentary on that addendum is the video above is for the song This is Gospel by the band Panic at the Disco, and it contains a visual representation of the concepts discussed above. In particular, around the 2:10 mark, it shows the man having his belly opened up to reveal rope within him. That rope is taken out by the practitioners working on him, and the very rope from within him is used to bind him in the next segment of the video. The symbolism is not subtle, and it is very apt. Check it out. Okay. All right. Okay. I think I'm done ugly crying. Um, no matter how many times I watch those commercials, they still affect me. All right, so let's move the microphone out of the way a little bit. Okay, so we will open up the calls. If you would like to talk a little bit about what we've been discussing, share some of your own perspective, feel free to call 210-422-2222. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is in dire need of a bath. You smell like a dog. He doesn't care. He's a good boy. All right. So in the meantime, while we're waiting, let's see if there were any comments. Again, you can call 210-422-2222. Okay, let's see. Natural Man says, open up the phone lines. I'd like to discuss what's happening with these narratives and how they affect motion. The church used a variant of Iron John, so certainly if you would like to call the Natural Man, feel free to do so. All right, let's see. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, how are you today?
I'm doing well. What's on your mind?
Excellent. Just giving a call just in regards to the recent Mormon Stories video that came out with Dr. Rittner.
Okay.
And just how eye-opening it was to see how really wrong Smith got everything undeniably wrong. And yet the doubling down you see from the church and just the growing of conspiracy theories and the digging in of heels is really, I think, telling of what the church is.
Yeah.
I think you can just tell a lot. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay.
You can also just tell a lot about how an organization, whether they be religious or not, handles a black eye like this. Do they set up thoughtful discussion? Do they say, well, we don't know everything, we'll get back to you, and maybe have, again, a debate or a discussion with people of another view? Or do they come up with, laughable conspiracy type theories to just kind of double down on things?
Yeah. And it's one thing to see members wrestle with this, but they end up having to take the lead from the apologists. And so when you see the acrobatics, the mental acrobatics the apologists have to go to, it gives you a sense of the scale of just how ludicrous it is. They've had to go from redefining the word translate to retreating to a completely indefensible position where you simply say, well, I have a bias that everything Joseph Smith said is true, so I'm just going to start with that assumption. And of course, other people have a bias that they're just, religious bigots, so they assume that everything Joseph Smith said was false. And, let them have their bias. I have my bias, and that's it. And it's something that's so divorced from reality and logic that you start to see it for what it is. And there's going to be kind of a tipping point or a threshold of ridiculousness, I think, that everybody has when you realize that if they have to go to that extent in order to defend and explain what's going on, then I really need to start looking at the possibility that Joseph Smith was actually a religious con artist. Because if you allow that possibility to be considered and then tested against everything that happens, that is much more explanatory about all of the different inconsistencies. It all makes sense.
Yeah, and I think one key phrase you said was divorced from reality, where, that's what I think you have to employ, or one of the dangers, or maybe, I don't know, danger, but privilege that a religious organization feels like they can do, that once they've been demonstrably proven wrong, they can go on to magic or spirituality, which really isn't much different from each other. They can just say, well, it can be any source he could have read, Moby Dick, and gotten all the inspiration for Abraham's life, and boom, there it is. So it's kind of like, it's not like dealing, right? You can't deal with logic or really reality when it comes to disproving religion. They can just retreat into the magic bubble, which is very frustrating. It's hard. I try to deal with this with my parents and a few of my siblings who are still in the church. And that's often the refuge is, for lack of a better term, well, we don't understand, boom, 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 essentially magic.
Right. And every step they can rely on knowing that the earnest believer is going to immediately diminish their own faculties of logic and reason and assume what they're saying, because their identity is tied up in it with the same forces that we've discussed in this presentation. You don't want to be the victim of a grand religious deception that influenced your entire worldview and your entire identity. It's really hard to come to that conclusion, because then you have to confront all of the things that you may have lost, all of the relationships that may have been distorted in some way, all the choices that went into your life that were distorted because of that deception. It's a very humiliating prospect to face.
Yeah, 100%. Humiliation definitely is the thing trying to be avoided. But I think it also was really insidious to kind of have this magic bubble to retreat into, because watching one of your other videos that came out a few months ago about the bishop interviews, essentially a lot of those defenses come down to magic as well. Well, he has the gift of discernment. Well, he's a judge of Israel. Things aren't going to go wrong. Why would God put somebody in place like that? And then when you played the sound clip of her saying, I've read these articles and they're really bad, referring to the people who've had the abuse stories, it was almost like that was just kind of dismissed, and then went on to about how good the Holy Ghost can be in protecting people and in improving things, even though essentially nothing's changed. People can now have maybe an option if you want to ask your parent or somebody else to come with you, and yet they still will ask children, young teens, a middle-aged man asking a teenage girl about climaxing. And all of this, again, when you bring it up, of how insane that sounds, and how much Mormons would mock Catholics over this and their issues that they've had. Well, they all of a sudden will reach, well, our magic is different. And that's what it comes down to. And it's so dangerous, because it just gives people of that mindset a retreat to hide into. And it can almost, and unfortunately in the States and Canada, faith is such a buzzword or a magic word, again, that it's used to also usually shut down conversations. Well, this is my faith. Please don't attack my faith. It's sacred. Again, sacred faith used interchangeably. And it's just, and for many people, they hear that and they go, okay, well, I don't want to be disrespectful, I'll shut it down. When in fact, it should be like, no, faith, your faith in this case, like most cases, is poison. And it's leading to destructions of other people's lives. And I think that's something that unfortunately is just, it still holds a pedestal in North American society, the idea of faith.
I think when you acknowledge some of these defense mechanisms that are part of just the normal human psyche that get exploited by religions, then it has to modulate how you approach those conversations. Because if you lead with your faith is poison, then the person you're talking to is going to immediately see you as a threat. I think if you understand these mechanisms, you have to realize that you can't start the conversation at that level. You do have to go back to, well, any faith, I think there's some common things you can discuss, which is, both you and I would acknowledge that there are religious manipulators out there, people who will exploit the belief and piety of earnest people who want to please God. And I think that's something any Mormon would agree with. And they would just point to the Scientologist or the Jehovah's Witness. You could use those examples. And then you say, what would it take to demonstrate to an earnest believer of those faiths? Well, you'd probably need to go back and examine the founders of the faiths and their claims. And then you could probably agree that, if an examination of contradictions of these founders would have the power to demonstrate those things, then if Mormonism is true, it should be able to really withstand that type of scrutiny. And that's hopefully a way to start a conversation that will, it's all about like navigating defense mechanisms and not trying to trigger those mechanisms which will shut down conversation. But it's tough.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. You have to be, thoughtful and use, a tactic that would encourage conversation and not discourage it. Kind of leading in, just one last point I want to ask, not so much make. Any chance that you could get a missionary on? I remember around COVID, when COVID first hit, there was a missionary who was supposedly supposed to come on. I guess he didn't show up a few times. But ever think of having a TBM or someone really hardcore into the church who would be open for a conversation? 'Cause, I mean, that's one thing you don't really see too much on a lot of the YouTube channels. Yours, again, I just want to say, I think is one of the better, more polished ones. It's great. It never really fails to deliver. But that's one thing you kind of find with a lot of this on both sides, is just preaching to the choir. And I think a lot of times when you watch, not so much a debate, but an open forum discussion, that's when you really can see for yourself how well your ideas hold up, or maybe you even come away with a new perspective, which I find often happens.
Yeah, I had a handful of missionaries say that they would be willing to do it, and we set up a time, and invariably the morning of something would come up. And the way I was able to connect with a lot of these was in some forums where there was the idea that you could freely talk about and debate things. And what it seemed to happen is that the non-missionary Mormon apologists who were in that forum would private message the missionaries and fill their heads full with the idea that I was trying to trap or deceive them, and that I would end up being, they would end up hurting the church more than not if they participated in such a discussion. And, these are like older people talking to 20-year-olds and 18-year-olds. And so they would invariably just say, I can't do it, or there's some sort of unexpected missionary meeting, but I don't want to reschedule. And so, the invitation is still open. I think one of those apologists has said that they would be willing to engage in that type of discussion. And so I'm certainly open to that, but I haven't heard anything back. But it's still definitely on my slate of things that I would like to do.
Yeah, because I got to say that would definitely get a lot of views. It would be great to watch. And you honestly just don't see much of it out there. I mean, a lot of times you'll see, Christians from other Christian denominations, and I'll give it to them. They're going to wear their heart on their sleeves. You can find endless debates where they're willing to put themselves out there and at least address the people. And you just it's a funny thing. I mean, I was a missionary too for the Mormon Church about 20 years ago, and it's just a curious thing that despite the scriptures saying, contend for the faith, get out there,
they don't do it.
They are just the most anti-debate people. I mean, oftentimes they'll tangle in the words, contentions of the devil, even though Paul says to contend for the faith. So I think they it's just a funny thing that, for people who love to go door to door and have a huge missionary program, they really hate open forum discussions. Other than maybe the only one I can think of is Kwaku, which I'm not a big fan, but I will give it to him that he has the balls to go out there and address these issues where most people just run away.
He selects his targets, though. He's only willing to enter into a discussion where if they use some sort of logical construct to disprove Mormonism, he can use the exact same logical construct to disprove their form of Christianity. And so they have to be willing to use some weapon against him that they're not vulnerable to, and he's figured out that there's very few of those things that you can do. Now, I will say that
that's 100% true.
Yeah, I will say that I did participate in one debate on somebody else's channel with a believing Mormon. He's and
I saw that, and it was one of the few ones out there, and it was great.
Yeah. And so, but in the future, though, I didn't want to frame them as debates. I wanted to frame them as discussion or dialogue, not with the intention of somebody being declared a winner, just with the intention of both of us coming away with better understanding of each other's positions and how each of us respond to the most common criticisms from either side. And so that's the framework that I posed to the missionaries. I even at one point said, okay, why don't you list the questions, or here's a slate of questions that potential investigators may have. That way there's no surprise in the questions and you know what they are. We just want to hear a response and then a follow-up, but still nothing has happened.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm hoping to the God that I don't really believe in due to lack of evidence that you do find someone who's willing to engage in an open discussion, because hey, that would be great. So, but again, thank you for addressing my issue and for taking time out of your day to have this show. It's great.
All right, great. Thanks for the call.
Okay, bye.
Bye now. Okay. So, let's see here. If you would like to join the discussion, you can, well, here we go. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. Hello? Hello?
This is Tara. Can you hear me okay now?
Oh, yeah, hi.
Hi.
I can hear you.
So I just want to engage in this conversation around feelings. I'm about, a good year into my faith transition, and I wanted to tell you about a conversation that my son, who's totally out of the church now, had with my parents. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we're sitting around the table having a family discussion, and my son came out as gay and had some really hard experiences with some church leaders that just turned him really negative. And he's also super logical. And so somebody had said something at the dinner table about how they knew the church was true, and he just immediately was like, "No, Grandpa, you believe it. You don't know." And my dad just puffed up like a pufferfish and stood up and was just his energy just got really big. And he's like, "I know, I have felt it. I've prayed, and I know from the feelings that I've had." And Jacob was just adamant. "You don't know, Grandpa. You just believe. You've had feelings, but you don't know the church is true." And my dad stormed off, and my mom, who's the opposite, got all quiet. She was like, "Jacob, I just know that it's true. I have felt it in my heart and my soul, and I know the church is true." And he just again looked at her and said, "Grandma, you can't know that." And it was a weird moment for me because I was still in the middle of my own transitioning process. But at that moment, I was just like, holy crap, he's right. My 16-year-old kid is right. And he's teaching me this lesson and I just had to start analyzing everything. I felt this same feeling when I was reading the Chronicles of Narnia. And I can still distinctly remember the day that I read the last chapter of Where the Red Fern Grows to my young kids. And we were all sitting on the couch bawling, feeling the warm fuzzies. And I'm just thinking, well, does this mean we all need to go get coonskin caps and declare that every dog must be named, Little Ann and Big Dan? It was just this transformational moment where I realized that feelings are not facts, that it's so hard. It's so hard to accept that. It almost just kills you.
Particularly with all the implications that come after when you realize that if that was not true, if the myth that those feelings indicated truth
Right.
was wrong, then all of the other things that you accepted on the basis of that truth have to be completely torn down, and then you're confronted with those existential questions, which, when you look at people outside of Mormonism, they've had to, unless they're under the influence of their own particular precious myth, they've had to come to grips with uncertainty, and they've had to come to grips with kind of almost the nihilistic despair that you have to work through in order to once again find meaning and value in your life in the face of uncertainty. And it's almost like when they talk about ex-Mormons having to go through an adolescence that they never had, usually they'll focus on things like they end up going too far with drinking or other things, when a lot of that repeated adolescence is really just kind of coming to terms with some of these deep, important questions about existence that really part of the process of growing up and maturing and becoming an adult is reconciling those things and coming to terms with them. And that, for me, has been one of the more difficult and yet rewarding aspects of going on that journey.
Yeah. my sister, who left about 3 years ago, we were having a conversation, and we were like, we're basically like 2-year-olds. We never learned how to critically think. We never learned how to analyze anything. And even me, like, I look back, I have 6 kids, and my answer to them when they would come to me was, Mom, I don't know what to do. It was always, well, have you prayed about it yet? Yeah. And I think, like, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad answer, but why didn't I sit down and, like, pro and con list with them and think and talk about consequences and talk about how this would have, like, why didn't I do that with them? Why was everything, well, let's just see how we feel?
Yeah. And to me, I mean, there's this notion of infantilization that happens in religious paradigms or other paradigms where you are deprived of your own individual agency and conscience, and every question that comes up involves a deferral to authority, whether it's scriptural authority or religious authority, or this idea that you pray for a feeling that is going to reinforce what your psychology already understands, is that you cannot have an answer that's out of harmony with what the leaders always say. So even like in politics, my parents were Republican, and so I just assumed I was Republican. And then the question is, well, a policy or question that our nation is facing, how do we know what's right and wrong? Well, you just see what the brethren say. And it's just a surrender of agency and working through complex issues, starting from first principles and then seeing how they apply in various issues, it's like a mental exercise that develops muscles of moral agency. And when you go through life only having surrendered that process to the brethren, then you have never developed those muscles. And so I could totally see you sitting down with your sister and realizing that those muscles have never been developed. Yeah. And so then you have to go around and part of that is figuring out who you are. Who am I? What do I believe is right and wrong? Because much to the surprise and chagrin of true believing Mormons, ex-Mormons still have a moral compass. They still understand that there are things that go beyond what is ethical, what is moral, and it's just recalibrating that so that it's not rooted in religious authority, particularly a religious authority that claims exclusive right to overturn any other moral concept if it so demands, which if you've read the Happiness Letter or seen the presentations on that, that was central to Joseph Smith's moral framework.
Yeah. Yep. And I have a missionary out right now, and that's been quite a challenge. Yeah. And so when I was trying to explain to him about how I feel about the LGBT issues and the church being wrong, and I told him, like, the brethren are wrong about this, son. The brethren are wrong. And he just starts crying, like, the brethren are not wrong. The church doesn't make mistakes, Mom. The brethren know what they're talking about. They always do. And I just broke my heart, because that's what I taught him. I taught him to always look to the brethren and to use your own mind and say, I feel, but then you go back to the feelings, because the reason why I know that the brethren are wrong about the way they're handling the LGBT stuff is because it feels so wrong. And because I have a gay kid, and I'm watching him, and I'm seeing the evidence that what they have said, what they have taught is wrong, and it feels awful. But I must be having the wrong feelings, according to my missionary son, because the brethren should always be able to tell me how to feel.
Yeah, it's tough. And I think it's easier to hold that position if you are unfamiliar with the details of the brethren's past moral failures. So if you don't know the extent to which the brethren taught racist ideology under the notion of the will and law of God, then you don't understand how wrong they've been in the past, which has implications for how wrong they may be now. And it's a process. I didn't even start that journey until I was in my 30s, late 30s. And so, I think it's difficult when you have kids in a situation where you can see that they're devoting their identity and their lives to something that you've come to see as a deception, but still understanding that you do have to give them the opportunity to make their own pathway. I think it just expands what type of parent you can be, and that rather than continuing to teach that closed-minded, follow the brethren way of looking at the world, you can start to teach and show by example a more expansive view of how to deal with the issues. How do grandparents and grandchildren repair relationships after a confrontation like the one that you've described? Has there been any measure of reconciliation there?
In my family, it kind of just gets swept under the rug, like the rough conversations. Um, I, it's kind of a cool dynamic that we have. There's 4 siblings. My brother left the church when he was like 16. He was very young, and he's been out for a long time and just kind of standing back, feeling isolated and alone. And then my sister left 3 years ago. Now I am, and my poor parents are just like, oh, we're lost. But they show an incredible amount of love. But the love is always like, I love you no matter what, and that feels like garbage. But they try to be kind, and I know they love my son, and I think that they're just kind of chalking it up to, well, someday he'll understand, just holding out that we'll somehow be able, if they're righteous enough, that we'll be able to be an eternal family, even though so many of us are lost.
And it's sad to see how they themselves are the victim of the type of deception that would tell parents that they are failures if their children leave the church, because now they're left seeing themselves as somehow flawed and less than, when just by rejecting that deceptive lie, they could see that they've been able to raise people who are able to think critically and independently and make a pathway for themselves that is a more authentic expression of who they are as individuals.
Yeah.
And
I mean, my mom has lived the last 20 years in a state of huge sorrow over what did she do wrong that my brother left. And she just overanalyzes it and thinks about it over and over again. It just has been such a huge area of sorrow for her. And I think how much time she's wasted feeling like the worst parent in the world, when my brother is amazing. He loves and cares for his family. He works harder than any man I know. He would drop everything to come and help anybody who needed it. But because he's not a member, it's not like that stuff doesn't count, but it doesn't mean as much because it won't save him.
And you have that distance that just inherently comes into those relationships when you have this us versus them mentality that the church requires its members to have just by nature of being the chosen people. It's just really tough to get around. I've as soon as I saw that my mom was willing to say, well, the prophet's wrong, then I had some hope. Now, granted, she was saying that about the letter that you get when I resigned from the church, and it says, like, you are going to be stripped of your priesthood and all of your temple blessings. And I'd show that to my mom, and she's like, well, the prophet's wrong. and so my mom still sees me as having the righteous priesthood and everything, and on some sort of journey. But in that way, she's been able to still feel just as close to me, and has been able to affirm to me that she sees me as a just and good person, despite my differing views on the church. And so there's been a measure of healing because of that, because I know it caused her a lot of pain and sorrow early on. So I can feel for
my mom can get
mom.
there.
Yeah. Well, there's hope.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for the call. Yeah.
You're welcome.
All right, take care.
Thanks. Okay, bye.
Okay, so we are, let's see, we're approaching an hour and 15 minutes. If you would like to call and join in the conversation, then I think this is going to be a spam call, but we'll see. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hey.
This is the natural man. I left you a comment.
Oh, yeah. So what's on your mind?
Well, first I just wanted to say that I really enjoy your podcast, and I like the fact that you're local. It's nice to. I know I've never met you before, but it's just nice to hear ideas from people who are local.
All right, that's why I was thinking that it might be a spam call because it was a area code I recognized.
Yeah, yeah. So I appreciate that. I think you do a really good job deconstructing Mormonism, and I think that this episode in particular, talking about priestcraft, essentially, the book you're reading from, he calls it shamanism, but essentially priestcraft. I've really been enjoying it.
So you mentioned earlier that there was a lot of things that you wanted to talk about, narratives and how they interact with emotions. What were you referring to?
Well, a little bit of background on me, so it kind of makes sense. Obviously, because I'm calling you, I was born and raised Mormon, and I'm not anymore. I would be what most people would call atheist, in the sense that I don't believe in a supernatural being. I'm very much a staunch evolutionist, but I do believe in my studies of religion for the past 4 or 5 years now that religious narratives and mythologies evolved out of man's need to have meaning. Because as a higher organism, we have a consciousness, and that consciousness is very complex. And the world, as we all know, is unpredictable. So our brains have to create a story to give us any kind of direction in life. So how this ties back to myth is these myths that play on your emotions and whatnot. The reason you're feeling that psychological connection to whatever is going on is because it's a reflection of the life cycle in narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this type of analysis is something that you will see expanded on profusely in Jordan Peterson's discussion of religion and the utility of religious archetypes that he describes and how they interact with the human need for meaning.
Yeah. And the video in particular I was watching that you shared, and I'd seen it before years ago, with the Chinese guy who is essentially having what I was calling, it's kind of a variation on the Iron John myth, which Iron John is one of Northern Europe's oldest myths. It may even be older than Job, and it's about masculine initiation and the father transferring himself into the son.
You're referring to the commercial where the mother gave birth to the child and quickly brought the child to the dying father?
Yeah, and like I said, it's not a perfect parallel, but these narrative structures exist in all religions to a degree. They use them because they have resonance, like what you're talking to earlier. It makes you identify with it. And so, like, for example, the Christian narrative of God the Father, and the Father transfers everything into the Son, and at the death of the Son, or just prior to the death, there has to be an atonement, an at-one-ment with the Father, which is, if you were looking at it in a non-magical language, that would be the equivalent of reconciling with the circumstances of your life that you were born into, that you had no control over. That would be the I guess, how would you put it, the non-spiritual way of explaining it.
How do you approach when you make a study of these things and you see that these are myths and stories that have meaning that is part of the human psyche because of our status as higher level conscious beings? Do you see that and then dismiss that meaning as trivial, or do you allow that meaning, even understanding that it's mythological, to hold sway in your mind as you approach your own life?
Well, at first I'll tell you that I did dismiss it, especially when I read Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene, which I've probably read a dozen times now, because Dawkins does a great job of explaining evolution, and their studies of the genome have reinforced that a lot. And when you get to the end of that book, it's hard to come out of it the first time anyway and be like, wow, there really is no meaning to life. So I was definitely there at one point. But as I read it over and over again, and as I was on the side reading more about religion and mythology, I came to realize, and Dawkins says this himself, that consciousness and meaning is something that our brains had to evolve as it got bigger, because no longer could we function on lizard brain instinct, because that wasn't enough to deal with complex sociology. So narrative building had to evolve naturally. And so as I learned that, it kind of changed the way I started looking at religion. And again, not priestcraft, because it's very different. I'm not talking about the power structures and gatekeeping and all that, but it changed the way that I looked at religion as being a way for higher level organisms to find meaning and order in their life, and that finding that order brings you mental stability and wholeness because you have a meaning, and that you could call that pure love of God / nature. Nature is making you feel good because you're doing the things in life that you're supposed to be doing to be a functioning genetic survival machine, as Dawkins would say.
So where does this softening of your stance on organized religion lead you? Does it lead you to the point where you could see yourself joining in fellowship with some religious group under the notion of a shared mythology from which you derive meaning and wholeness from a psychological perspective? Or is it hard to reconcile those things?
Well, I think right now, with the way things are going and as crazy as things have been, it's hard to say. So I haven't figured out that answer for myself yet either. But I do think that our culture in general has for a long time got away with the more natural side of religion and have become more and more drawn in towards the dogma. And the reason that I theorize that happens is because if you think of early Christians, they lived very close to nature and the life cycle. And as we've industrialized, we get further and further away from that, and we don't connect religion to nature as much as our ancestors may have. We still do it to an extent. Like if you watch, for example, General Conference, what do they always show at the beginning and end? Pictures of nature and Temple Square. And anytime they want to elicit an emotional response, it's always a beautiful landscape if it's not a narrative. So I've kind of gotten to the point where I am looking for something, because I do believe that humans need community and hierarchy and a common story to rally around. But what that is and where I should go in this day and age, because everybody is so focused on dogma and the narrative, I have not figured that out yet.
Well, I can sense a kind of a similar journey of realization in myself, in that I think when you're raised in this hierarchy-oriented, authoritarian religious paradigm, and you assume that's what all churches are. But when you step out and you start examining what are these other churches just on their own, you see that there are churches and communities centered around religions that don't have this authoritarian paradigm, that don't hold metaphysical inquisitions on belief, and that allow people of many different perspectives to join in their community without the sense of condemnation that goes with wrongthink that you may see in Mormonism. And that those communities bring great value and meaning to the people involved in them, even without exacting these, appeals to obedience and submission. And so that's really kind of, I hope that viewers will get a sense that this channel is not like some of the militant atheist channels where my mission is to denigrate religion and everything that religion has to do, because I personally have found a great local community that through the community of their religion has brought a lot of value to in my case, community theater and helping people join together in fellowship with that. And so I really value that. And that has led to me helping them in other aspects of their faith community, even though I've told them I'm not really a joiner. Like, I don't join, and I probably won't participate in ordinances. And I really have a hard time with chanting things in unison because of what that has been in my past. But I don't doubt the value that the community has for them. And it's true even to an extent in Mormonism, that there is value that Mormonism brings to its community. It's just really difficult when you see the cost that it exacts for that benefit. And there's a lot of potential in Mormonism for it to improve and disregard some of that cost, but yet continue to become more welcoming and more inclusive and hold on to the things that are valuable from a community perspective. But it's really hard for an authoritarian, totalistic paradigm to transform into something that's not that, because you don't give up power. So I appreciate you sharing your perspective on some of the narrative. And there is a series that I plan on doing with some other people from other faiths about the power of three different things, which is dogma/ideology, narrative, and identity. Because those three things taken together really affect your own self-conception and your world conception, regardless of whether you're talking something in the religious realm or something in the secular realm. And I think we're starting to see how those things are really starting to affect the current events of our world in general, not just in religious terms. And so there's something really powerful to be had in the discussion around that, I believe.
Yeah, I agree. For sure.
All right. Well, thanks for your call, and maybe we'll be able to meet up sometime and meet face to face since you're local.
Yeah, I would love to.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Okay, so let's see here. Gimpy Geezer says, I've had such tender thoughts about my late father. Tears were streaming down my face as well. I'm glad you have Yugi, the Yugi support system. You's a good guy. Yeah, he left, but he came in just at the right time. I think, I've forgotten how powerful those commercials were just in knowing the exact right heartstrings to pull. So if you have any thoughts on our discussion so far, the phone number is 210-422-2222. You can dial in and join us in our discussion. Feel free to add any comments there. Let's see here. Raw Hamburger asks, why are Thai commercials so amazing? I have no idea. But at least it shows you that some of these emotions, some of the themes, you remember there was this song about Russians love their children too, where in the era of the Cold War, we tended to dehumanize our political enemies when it was very clear that that was not a problem. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, Jonathan, thanks for taking my call. I appreciate it. Love your YouTube channel and a lot of the things you talk about. I just wanted to get in on the discussion today. I've thought a lot about this. I'm an active member of the church, and but I probably consider myself pretty nuanced. I'm very aware of all the issues, and I've had my own struggles with coming to grips with them and how to reconcile all that. I won't go into maybe all that, but as it's come to, as you were talking about feelings and how to validate those, and when people say things like, I know the church is true, and then someone challenges that and says, well, that's your feeling. I think it's kind of a hard space because, feelings are really how we validate a lot of other things that we come to know. It's how we feel like we love our spouse or, love our children. Or when my older brother told me that he was gay, he said, I just have always felt this way, And then there's other feelings that I think are irrational, where if my child says, I feel there's a monster outside, I don't want to invalidate that, but I know that that may be irrational, but that other feelings are somehow planted in them, So I enjoyed the last caller as he was talking about some of the evolutionary aspects of how we've come to that. And I minored in philosophy in college, so I felt like from a pretty young age I did critically think, and there was always things that didn't set well with me, and I just kind of started using, I guess, that scripture, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, as kind of my guide, which was, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. And so I never have really felt like I couldn't challenge the feeling. And a lot of times when I look at things in our history, I go back and think, what was Joseph's motivation originally? Did things kind of get off at some point? Because at some point he was very motivated. And I'm probably more interested in that now, because I'm thinking there was something in his feeling, that was planted in him, maybe from an early on, that was more innocent. And things that maybe, that's a whole other discussion, but you listen and kind of go through things, and I think you just cannot invalidate certain things that you feel that are planted in you. And so when people come to a moral, I guess, way of life, whether it's in or outside of the church, I do think, whether evolutionary or not, it's something that I think we need to seek to say, why are those feelings seemingly planted in all humankind that want to strive for something that's good? And so we can't invalidate that. We can't say that just because someone feels something, well, you don't know because you haven't critically thought about it. Well, how do we get to certain conclusions that we may never be able to know? And so I just had to kind of look at certain mantras and say, look, if I have faith in something, I'm never going to expect or have anybody expect me to believe something that's not true. So I look at faith and say that it's the evidence of something hoped for that is true. And if I'm going to act as if, then I'm okay with that. If other evidences come along that say, you might need to pivot, then I feel like I've from a very many years been open to saying, yeah, that is not going to be right. And eventually, the instrument of humanity is going to get tuned into what's right. And I see many aspects of church policy changing. It sometimes is hard to look at that and say, why is it taking longer to kind of tune in to some of these things that we feel like, yeah, that's a more healthy behavior. This was unhealthy over here. We were doing that, So I don't know if you have any questions for me, but that's kind of where I'm at with this. I really feel like it's important to still look at that as something that is a moral kind of authority that we don't have to discard just because we want to engage in critical thinking.
Yeah, I think that you're spot on in that a lot of our decisions, a lot of our conception of ourselves in the world is based around things that we feel by emotion. Your observation that there are, I think the term you used is with your son who might be scared of a monster or feel that there's a monster, there may be, what was the word that you used? Yeah, irrational emotions. Right. And I think that's another way. That's another way of saying that some emotions are based on incorrect conclusions, or some emotions are not tied to reality. And so I think that uncertainty about the connection between our emotions and reality is a point that is worth having a bit of humility about, the extent to which we connect emotion with reality in our beliefs. And like you said, we don't want to have faith in something that is not true. Can you have faith in something that is not true? Well, it depends on how you analyze it. If you start with the definition that faith can only be had in something that is not true, then when you discover that something you had faith in isn't true, then you have to redefine what you had. You have to say, well, I didn't really have faith then, I had a delusion. And so it was never faith, it was simply a delusion. On the other hand, if you go back and you say, well, if I have faith in something and then I discover that it's not true, I have to acknowledge that faith can be had in things that aren't true. Now, I particularly liked your point about, the emotion that we feel that we love someone. And I had to confront this a little bit in my own life, because I think I was married for almost 20 years. And near the end of that, I believed that I loved my spouse and I believed that my spouse loved me, what do you do when you come across evidence that the trust that you had in your spouse has been betrayed? And you learn that your spouse has developed those feelings to somebody else and has been lying to you about it. Because then you learn that the love that you had, and the thing is, it doesn't change the love that you have, because you still are bound by that feel. That is authentically how I felt. There was a point where I remember writing, you could strap me into a chair, point a gun at my head and say, stop loving your spouse. And that wouldn't mean anything, because I can't stop loving my spouse. But there's a difference between the type of love that you would extend to any human being just by nature of the fact that they are another human being, and the trust and vulnerability that is inherent to a mutual loving relationship. And when that is taken from you, whether or not it's of your own free will, it dramatically alters your perception of that relationship, and you have to come to terms to it, particularly when you determine that it would be a danger to yourself and other loved ones if you continued in it. And so it's one of those things where it's complicated. Let's say that the story of the grandparent standing up and saying, I know it's true, was not actually our precious faith of Mormonism, but it was Jehovah's Witnesses. So then all of the things that you've raised in defense of faith and emotions being respectable would also be said in favor of that grandparent. Now, let's say that the grandson who is saying, you don't know it's true, is saying that from a perspective of having lost his brother who was in a car accident and needed a blood transfusion, which would have saved him. But the parents refused because they had been told by the religious authorities that God and Jehovah would hold them in disfavor, and that they would have failed their test of faith if they had submitted to the worldly demand for blood against Jehovah's will. Well, I think then we could say that there's a very tangible risk that goes along with rooting your acceptance of truth and reality in emotional appeals centered around the idea of faith, and that then would be a justification for really shifting more towards acknowledging that emotion and faith can both be misplaced, they can both be not tied to reality, and they can both be manipulated. And once you accept that, then you just have to have a much more humble approach to your own emotions and to your own professions of faith. And I think if you understand that, and then you go back and you read the stories of Joseph Smith, just because he does something good does not mean that everything that he does is true. And the concept of the honey and the trap, when you go and look at any religious predator or charlatan, there's always good that they do, which is how they attract people. That's the only reason we know about them, is because they had enough good to attract enough people that they made a footprint in history. And so you can go and look at Jim Jones and look at him in the 1960s, before the Civil Rights, having an integrated congregation and making an impassioned appeal against racism and against segregation. And he was unique and powerful in his ability to do that. And that's why he attracted so many people. He was ahead of the times in acknowledging and embracing the universal brotherhood of man. But that did not change the fact that he also deceived, manipulated, and abused those people behind him. And so, as much as I think for you or I, when we look at our own lives, we don't want to take the worst chapter of our life and have that be what we are remembered for or how you characterize us. When we look at people who, by nature of their assumed special divine connection, influence other people and get other people to alter their own lives around the ideology that they put forth, then you can look at their worst acts in that capacity and say that those things have an implication for whether or not that they can authentically claim divine authority. So even if Jim Jones or any other religious person said some good things, the reality of their abusive and manipulative things impeach any claim that they have to special divine authority. And when I look at the life of Joseph Smith, I can readily acknowledge many positive things about him. He was remarkably intelligent. He had an innate understanding of the human psyche, how to resonate with the piety and the desire to please God in everyone around him. He was able to be a charismatic individual who could get people to share his vision, and his vision was glorious and grandeur. He was somebody who really did speak in large concepts that appealed to a lot of people around him. But people like that who can persuade other people that way, who are able to be as facile with religion and piety as he was, have a great deal of sway and power to manipulate and deceive people. And when I look at things like the happiness letter, the record on polygamy, and some of the deception stuff, I can't disregard that, even while I can see and acknowledge the good things that he have, and even the good things that went after him, the good people that are in the church today and the good that they do. It's one of these complex, complicated pictures. So I appreciate somebody like yourself who's thinking about these things, and even while they're in the church are able to hold the blemishes of the church in the same hand that you hold the good parts of the church. And to the extent that you're able to shield yourself from those coercive and manipulative aspects of the church, then the church can be a good place to be. It's just at some point your drawing the boundary is going to conflict with some authority over you trying to impose something on you. And once you draw and hold to that boundary, you may find that despite your desire to remain in the good graces of the church, they will kick you out or shun you or somehow label you as something other than the faithful. And that's where, some of the harm comes to the forefront.
Well, and that's where I'll just say one last thing and I'll hang up. But I think that's, I guess my own predictions have been, that in the next, 3 to 10 or 20 years, there's going to be, I guess I look at it as a cleansing, kind of a massive reboot. I think COVID is maybe fast forwarding some of that, because I think there's a lot of people that are stepping away from maybe just some of the mental, I don't want to say being in a hypnosis, but just things where I think more people that I'm talking to and interacting with are recognizing certain things that are maybe culturally unhealthy that we as a system have bought into. It may not even be stuff that is, taught specifically from the pulpit anymore, but that we have been either taught as a younger generation has bled through, et cetera, or, whatever things. I think there's too many things right now that are coming into conflict and into, I guess, sort of, hitting up against each other in terms of these principles that people are saying that's an unhealthy practice. I know I listened to the episode that you had with Dr. Hanks on, and I think I look at a lot of the work that she's doing. She's standing up and saying these types of things are not healthy, and there's enough people that are saying, hey, that particular thing has to end. And so I'm hoping for those kind of things. I'm hoping that it continues to get to be a space that divests itself of some of these unhealthy practices that I think were at one point thought to be really on the high end of the totem pole in terms of virtues. So anyway, I will hang up, Jonathan. Really appreciate everything that you do, and keep it up. I love listening and watching.
All right, thanks for calling. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. I agree with him. I think that there is going to be some sort of reboot. I just hope it's in the direction that he's referring to, where we let go of some harmful practices. There is a risk, though, that some of these leaders that are much more the staunch sacrifice, obedience, McConkie type of leaders don't see this as an opportunity for something like a new 21st century reformation of the church, where they double down on harmful and hurtful practices under the heading of, we're going to sort the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats, and we're going to make it so that you really do have to sacrifice and prove your worth in order to be a faithful, upstanding member of the church, because that's going to be a problem. But I think historically the church doesn't really do that since the days of Brigham Young. The other thing that's going to happen is if you go from this high demand, totalistic, authoritarian type of religion to something that is much more individual oriented. Then if you Google, I think it's the Worldwide Church of God was a fairly sizable religious denomination that did that shift from totalistic authoritarian to much less so. And they saw that their entire body of members, the resources that they had to do things with just totally diminished, because once they let go of that, then people no longer had a reason to remain there for whatever reason. So, all right, we are approaching 2 hours. I don't want to get too long beyond that, but I think we have enough time for another caller. If you'd like to join the discussion, you can dial 210-422-2222. Let's see here. Any other comments on this? If there's something that you would like to see covered in a future episode, feel free to put that in the comments. Without any calls right here, we may actually end up going ahead and shutting things down. Yu-Gi-Oh has left me to my own devices, so I'm all alone. So let's see here. Yeah, I think that's it. So until next time, then, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Take care.